Thank you for coming to our monthly Issues in Aging seminar. We're really excited to have a colleague from St. Louis University, Cort Rudolph, present to us. The Center for Aging, we've been very interested in this notion of generations. And we teach a freshman class on aging and want to really confront this issue of generational stereotypes or descriptors, and really looking forward to learning from Dr. Rudolph about his work. Dr. Rudolph is an associate professor of industrial and organizational psychology at St. Louis University. He did his graduate training at Wayne State. His work focuses on aging workforce, lifespan development theories, well-being, work longevity, and this work on generations. So thank you for doing this for us, Cort. We're really interested in your work. Let me turn it over to you.
Okay, great. Thank you very much for that nice introduction. Can everybody hear me?
You're a little soft.
Okay.
Maybe it's just me. What do you think, Natalie?
A little soft, but I can still hear all right.
I think I can do something about that.
Let's hear you. Yeah, that's better.
Well, I haven't done it yet, so one second. Okay, I think that's as high as I can go. I'll just make sure I speak up. Is that okay?
Yes,
Yeah, that's better.
that's great.
Wonderful.
Thank
Well, I'm glad to be here, and I'm really thrilled to be able to share this work with you. This is sort of the product of the last, I don't know, 10 years or so of research that I've been doing related to aging at work. This is sort of a corner of that research because an inevitable question that you get asked when you are studying age and work is, well, could this all just be generations? And so I'm going to talk about generational differences at work today and sort of give you an overview of kind of where we stand as a literature, as a field, in our understanding of all these kind of complex issues. And of course, I can't switch the slide. There we go. Perfect. So what do we mean when we say generational differences? And so the idea of generational differences refers to this notion that there are demonstrable dissimilarities between members of different groupings of these successive birth cohorts, and that these differences manifest as kind of consequent differences in work outcomes. And so in the literatures that I work in, people talk about the potential for there to be generational differences in things like job attitudes, work values, motivations at work, motivations to work, and then other sort of performance related metrics, things like job performance or productivity or things like that. And so the implication of thinking about generational differences at work is that if there's differences here, these are things that we have to pay attention to, that we have to actively manage in the workplace. This idea of generations and of generational differences is fairly ubiquitous at this point. Even fairly cursory review of popular business and management literature we'll find dozens, if not hundreds perhaps, of articles that purport to think about different ways in which generations matter. We can see these across different topics and realms in the organizational sciences. In fact, I would suggest that this idea of generations and generational differences is so popular and ubiquitous that it's taken on a form of functional autonomy, which is to say that the idea of generations is often assumed at face, and the influence of generations is taken as some sort of axiomatic sort of rule that generations exist and that differences among them are obvious, in other words. So where does all this come from? So generations as a concept was borrowed from functionalist sociological theories that emerged in the early 20th century. And so one of the sort of key figures historically in the development of generations as a idea comes from Karl Mannheim. And Mannheim's work discussed how formative experiences early on in life, in the life course, might shape collective identities or the collective consciousness of generations. Things like the experience of wars or economic depressions. And to Mannheim and functionalist sociologists, generations were seen as an explanation for broad social or cultural change. And the whole idea of generations emerged from a thought question that Mannheim asked. That was something like, would social change be possible if there were no new generations of people to challenge the ideas that were, advanced by preceding ones? And so from a functionalist perspective, generations were viewed very much as a mechanism that shapes culture. So what's really interesting about this model, or this idea of generation shaping culture, is that this perspective has been kind of co-opted and flipped by more contemporary generations researchers. And so this is a quote from Jean Twenge, who is a generations researcher from 2017. And she says that generations are shaped by trends in culture. And this creates this sort of what I call a cycle or a tautology of generations versus culture, which becomes really difficult to unpack in research and theory, where we're not really sure if cultures are influencing the formation of generations, or if generations are really shaping the cultures in which they are, operating and living. Generational differences, which is to say differences among members of different assumed generational groups, have long been invoked to explain changes in work-relevant outcomes, things like attitudes and behaviors and motives, as I suggested. And so we can go back to the 1960s, a book by Diamant, who talks about generation gaps in leadership and management phenomena. Tulgin talks about managing Generation X in the mid-90s. Edgar Schein, who writes about organizational culture and climate, discusses the role that generations play in transmitting organizational culture from older members of organizations to younger members of organizations. And so the language of generations is fairly present in the organizational sciences. A few more examples of this. Since 2013, the American Psychological Association's Work and Well-Being Survey has variously, oftentimes, reported generational group comparisons for several work outcomes. I'll show you an example of that in just a second. The APA Division 14, which is the Society for Industrial and Organizational Psychology, that's the professional organization that people like me who are IO psychologists identify most strongly with generally, has this yearly survey of top 10 workforce trends. And occasionally over the last 10 years or so, this idea about generations and assumed differences between them has emerged as one of these top workforce trends that scientists and practitioners are concerned about. Here's an example from the APA Work and Well-Being Survey of what I'm talking about. And here we can see we have like 6 categories, things like plans to change jobs and growth and development and employee recognition, down to more health-related things like stress and physical and mental health, that are broken out by these assumed generational groupings, and the differences assumed to exist between someone in sort of like the boomer category versus like the Gen X or the millennial category are taken as evidence to suggest that there are these generational differences that perhaps you need to pay attention to within things like physical or mental health or stress or something like that. These things are fairly ubiquitous, as I suggested. In fact, so much so that even like the curriculum of business schools has been tailored in some respects to account for the idea of generational differences. And so this is a business foundations course description that actually comes from the SLU Business School course catalog. So even at my home institution, we are teaching students in a 1-credit course that's required of MBAs about all the problems with generations and generational differences. And I'm sure you've seen these sorts of headlines somewhere, that millennials are killing the golf industry, or that they're killing Major League Baseball, or marmalade, the beer industry. They're drinking so much wine that it's changing how it's sold. Napkins, avocados in houses, that was a popular one for a while. Their wanderlust is killing the Canadian tourism industry, which is a huge issue. These headlines are everywhere, that certain members of certain groups, in this case, the much maligned and panned millennial cohort, has just, vastly changed the way in which, the modern society operates. What's really great about these headlines is that there's nothing new about these. Headlines from newspapers, bemoaning what youth is doing to society can be found going back for years, from the 1920s. In the 1907, we were worried about teddy bears dooming a generation. In 1900, this is one of the first headlines that I found in my work on how youth was somehow co-opting or changing the nature of work. And so this is blue-coated messengers want more money. They demand more money in sort of a labor context. But what's interesting is that officials say that their dime novel habit, which is essentially like, cheap pulp fiction sort of books, is responsible for this sort of change that we're seeing among young employees. You can go to a bookstore if you can find one these days, and you can buy books about how to manage members of different different generations. And so what you can see here on the left is a book called Managing the Millennials, which is a book for managers about how to deal with all these millennial employees that are doing all these things to change the nature of work. What's interesting is that on the right, you can also buy a book if you're a millennial who happens to be assuming a managerial position. So how do you manage if you're a millennial? So you get it from both sides. And what I love about this is that they're written by the same person. All right. So you get this sort of double-sided thing here. What do we do with all these millennials in the workplace? If you do a Google search for the phrase managing generational differences, you'll get thousands of results. A lot of these come in the form of training programs that consultancies will sell you to try to fix some of the ills that are faced that your organization is facing with regard to intergenerational tensions. And so this is a generations, I took just a screenshot here of generational differences, a training program that'll teach you how to understand millennials in the workplace and know what leadership style works best with members of different generations and so on and so forth. And so all of this being said, hopefully I've made the case for the sort of ubiquity of generations, and my guess is you probably already understood that that was the case. We need to ask ourselves a fundamental question, which is what influence does the notion of generational differences actually have on the processes that we care about in organizational science as researchers and practitioners? And the answer that the research that my colleagues and I have conducted in this area is, unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on how you think about it, in short, not much. A lot of the work that my colleagues and I have done on the topic of generation have called into question a lot of the assumptions that people commonly make in theories of generations and in research that has purported to study generational differences. And there's a variety of things that sort of lead us to the conclusion that there's not much to do about generations at work. And so before I sort of peel back the curtain and tell you why I don't think generations matter all that much, I think it probably behooves us a little bit to think about the arguments that are used in favor of generational differences. And so we can talk a little bit about sort of, theoretical and sort of logical arguments that are used, and also sort of more practical arguments. For example, there's this broad argument that the nature of work itself is changing. And so it's not sort of surprising to say that workforces and organizations are becoming increasingly older and age diverse, and that's driven by the fact that the population as a whole is becoming older and more age diverse, and that just filters into organizations and workforces. At the same time, the way that work is being done, broadly defined, is changing as well. So thinking about just one mechanism, for example, the implementation of technology has vastly changed the landscape of work processes over the last 30 years. So the workforce is changing, work itself is changing, and the nature of work itself is changing at the same time. And so we seek explanations for this sort of intersection between the changing nature of the workforce and the changing nature of work. And so in research, theories of generations are often invoked to explain those changes. And there's a couple of different arguments that are used. So for example, generational differences are often positioned as an antecedent to change, which is to say something like generational differences are an explanation for differences that we see in career patterns, for example. That argument can also be flipped around, and it often is. And the argument is that generations or generational differences are a reflection of the change itself, which again gets back to that sort of cyclical tautology of what shapes what that I brought up a few minutes ago. As a reflection of change itself, we see arguments made that, for example, members of different generations are reacting differently to, for example, economic recessions. And so there's a few, again, just different arguments that are used to explain the sort of nature, the changing nature of work, the changing nature of the workforce that get tied up in the idea of generational differences. The other kind of argument that's made is that the world broadly defined is changing. And so generations and generational categories that we apply to them are a means by which we can understand how complex social change, complex sociocultural phenomena manifest as age-related differences that influence individual level behaviors. And so another quote here from Jean Twenge, what's interesting here is that, she kind of backs off on a little bit on the sort of rote nature of generations and says that any generational cutoff is arbitrary, but what they do is they allow us to describe people despite obvious limitations of using kind of what they say is a bright line when a fuzzy line is closer to the truth. This leads us to a perspective that we've advanced in our research, which is the social constructivist perspective on generational differences. And so the idea that we advance in this model is that generations don't exist objectively, rather they exist as a sense-making mechanism. They're not really, it doesn't really make sense in many cases to think about generational differences because we have a lot of limitations that would allow us to directly identify them that we'll discuss in a little bit. So generational differences don't really exist in an objective sense. They're rather socially constructed, and they allow us to explain the complexities of the changing society that I discussed a minute ago against the complexities and intricacies of human development that we observe in day-to-day social interactions. From this perspective, if we think in terms of generations, this provides us with a useful heuristic for making a really complex issue, which is the process of aging, much less complex. And they give meaning in some respects to observations and perceptions that we have of age-related differences that we witness, again, on a day-to-day basis when we interact with people of different ages. So let's think about shifting gears for a second, moving away from arguments in favor of generations. Let's think about the empirical evidence that exists for generational differences. What's interesting about this field is that despite the sort of ubiquity of this, if we think about the relative presence of different topics that are studied in the organizational sciences broadly defined, actually there's very little empirical research on purported generational differences at work. And so about 10 years ago, David Costanza and colleagues published a meta-analysis where they were only able to identify 20 empirical studies that had looked at generational differences across a number of different work outcomes. And their conclusions were that the relationships between generational membership and work-related outcomes are moderate to small and essentially zero in many cases. In 2017, my colleagues and I conducted a systematic qualitative review of leadership and generations related phenomena. And we could only find 18 studies that were published in indexed journals or society-sponsored journals that were able to identify generational effects or study them by any means. And our conclusions from this review was that there was no evidence to support the presence of generational differences in leadership-related phenomena. And so we have a bit of a sense, I hope, of sort of what are the arguments that are used in favor of generations and what is the sort of empirical basis here. If we sort of shift gears for a second and think kind of on the contrary side of this, what are the arguments that would be opposed to generational differences? And this is a little bit more where my work on the topic comes into play. And so we're going to talk about some logical concerns associated with studying and identifying generations and generational differences. We'll talk about empirical concerns that would underlie the conclusions of any study that would be done on the topic. And then we'll talk about some sort of related methodological concerns as well. And so if we think more broadly from a logical perspective, I would offer that theorizing on generations and generational differences is at some level a fairly flawed model of behavior. If we assume generations exist and that there are differences between members of different generations, this assumes a very top-down deterministic mode of understanding behavior. And I say that because it assumes that all members of a given generation act largely in the same way. that's the sort of broader way in which generations become operationalized when people start to study them in empirical work, especially quantitative work. From the same sort of perspective, it's a rather reductionist model, in that we're losing a great deal of nuance when we distill complex aging phenomena into these rather simple generational units. One of my favorite, if not somewhat pedantic quotes here comes from Gottfried Leibniz, who says, natura non facit saltus, which is Latin, and it translates into nature does not take leaps. And so the assumption that we make when we define generations is that there is these strong demarcating lines, essentially, that we can draw between people of different ages that places them in one generational category versus another, which is a rather tenuous argument to support in many cases. Couple of other logical concerns here, and specifically related to the topic or the point that I just made. The application of generational explanations involves researchers, or it requires researchers to explore relationships among variables that are defined and measured at different levels, conceptual levels of analysis. And so we typically think about generations as being defined at the group level, whereas we think about work outcomes, most typically things like, work satisfaction or motivation or something like that at the individual level of analysis. And what this does is open up the potential for there to be different fallacies that are associated with cross-level phenomena at play. And so, for example, atomistic fallacies refer to a situation in which we make inferences regarding variability across groups, but we do that solely based on individual level data. And so we collect some, information from a few different people who, are of varying ages, and we broadly group them, and we kind of, go from bottom up and assume that there's these sort of differences among groups, but we're basing this solely on individual level data. So to the extent that we assume that person one and person two are different across these different groups, we might be conducting or committing an atomistic fallacy. An ecological fallacy kind of works the other way, and that's when we make inferences regarding phenomena at the individual level based on group level data. And so we assume that all members of a generation, for example, act similarly because we have placed a label on them, which is a challenge as well. As I suggested, and shifting gears a bit towards more empirical concerns, there is meager evidence at best to support the existence of generational differences phenomena. And I'll qualify that a little bit in just a second when we talk about some more of the methodological concerns at play here. As I suggested, the Costanza et al. Meta-analysis failed to find support, broadly speaking, for generational differences across a number of work outcomes. I actually spoke to David Costanza a few days ago, and they have a new kind of replication of that with 10 more years of data, and the conclusions haven't changed since the original paper was published in 2012. Another paper by Stassen and colleagues finds very similar conclusions. Somewhat related meta-analysis by Zabel and colleagues, again, found no support for generational differences in work ethic endorsement. A lot of the sort of writing around generational differences at work has focused on changes in work ethic. That's kind of a common critique of people from younger generations, especially, that their work ethic is not as high as members of older generations, but the literature doesn't pan that conclusion out. A conclusion that was reached in a review paper from 2014 by Lyons and Curran suggested that evidence has been sparse for some variables and inconsistent for others, and that there remains a great deal of variation in methodologies and reporting of findings, making it very difficult to draw definitive conclusions from the research on generations. A more recent paper by Costanza and colleagues applied a variety of different statistical models that are used to study and identify generational differences by looking across a single data set. And so the idea would be to consider how a variety of different statistical models, one being what's called cross-temporal meta-analysis, which is something I'll come back to in just a second, an approach called cross-classified hierarchical linear modeling, and cross-sectional analysis. All three of these models are quite commonly used to identify generational effects. Unfortunately, for the phenomena at play here, Costanza et al. Find that these methods do not converge with one another, which is to say that any conclusions that one could draw regarding generational effects or generational differences could be in part dependent on the approach that analysts use to statistical analysis, which is, to me at least, I think kind of a large liability in this literature, which is that depending on how you actually ask the question, you might reach very different answers regarding the presence or absence of generational differences. Another concern here, which is sort of wrapped up in the previous point, is that a lot of the research that attempts to study generational differences uses cross-sectional or single time point research designs. Cross-sectional methods, unfortunately, cannot be used to identify or address questions about generations. And that's because they conflate chronological age, so the year, the age you actually currently are, with contemporaneous period effects and what are called birth cohort effects, which are the effects that are typically taken as evidence for generational differences. And this confounding issue is fairly easy to understand. So if we consider, like, let's assume that the current year is 2021. And if we know that someone's age is 37, then their birth cohort is determined, because if we take the contemporaneous period of 2021 and we subtract current age from it, we get 1984 in this case. And so in a single time point data collection, the year of data collection is almost always held constant, kind of by virtue of the design. And so what that means is that any conclusions that we would draw concerning cohort effects, which, to be clear, and again, is the evidence that's typically taken in support of generational differences, is actually ambiguous. It could be due to either birth cohort or chronological age. So each is an equally likely source of variance, or assumed, the assumed causal mechanism at play. And then we have to fall back on theory to parse the confounded sources of variance from one another. So that's a big challenge with this whole literature, is that most of it is based on a research methodology, which is to say a cross-sectional, typically survey design, which doesn't actually allow us to identify generational effects. So there's a variety of ways that we can account for this confounding, which is probably what we're more used to seeing in this literature. And one way to do this is to create these synthetic groupings of people into different broader categories of generations. And what this would allow us to do is at some level avoid directly confounding age and cohort effects with one another in these types of research designs. And so what we generally see is that people artificially lump together members of different birth cohorts with certain ranges to create generations. And this is where we get the operationalization of, for example, people who are Generation X versus millennials versus boomers or something like that. The problem with this is that there's very sporadic agreement about how to do this. And so you can pull two different papers out of the literature that purport to study the same generational differences phenomenon, but they could use very different cutoffs for the establishment of these birth year groups to define their generations. And so here's a figure that kind of does I hope does a nice job of explaining what I'm trying to say here. This is from a paper that I did in 2017, where we went through and coded the different cutoffs that are used across leadership studies to define different generations. And what you can see here is that, there's very sporadic agreement as marked by the endpoints of these sort of bars. Like, these are technically called dumbbell plots because they look like little dumbbells. But you can see that the ranges that are used across these studies are really different. And in some cases, one generation is actually labeled differently in some studies than another generation. So for example, Generation Y or millennials are labeled with the same birth year cutoffs in some cases as people from Generation X, and so on and so forth. We see confusion kind of around, baby boomers and how those are defined as well. And so there's very little agreement or guidance in the literature, which again becomes kind of an issue for the analyst, because it then creates a wide variety of researcher degrees of freedom in terms of how these different groups are operationalized and studied. Another topic that I've taken up in my research is a common approach to studying generations that are generally classified as cross-temporal methods. And so a common approach that's used to study to study generations is actually a kind of a variation on traditional meta-analytic approaches called cross-temporal meta-analysis. So in any sort of cross-temporal method, the general approach here is to try to hold age constant over time. And so one way to do this is to find archival data or published data that looks at independent samples of, for example, 18-year-olds who were studied in 1990, 2000, 2010, so on and so forth. This is the approach to cross-temporal meta-analysis that Jean Twenge and colleagues have developed and advanced in the literature. And so if we can find independent samples that report on the same phenomena over time, holding age more or less constant, what that allows us to do is instead of confounding cohort and age effects with one another, we're holding age constant. Now we confound cohort and period effects with one another. And then we use theory to try to parse the differences between whether or not this is a cohort effect or a period effect. Now the challenge here is that anytime you confound two sources of variance with each other, each is going to be an equally likely cause of the observed variation that we see. And then again, we have to fall back on theory to say, is this a cohort effect that would suggest a generational difference, or is this a period effect, which would suggest something a little bit more contemporaneous is going on? So again, even though they're quite popular in the literature, cross-temporal methods broadly defined, including cross-temporal meta-analysis, cannot draw valid conclusions about generational differences. Another challenge with this is that cohort and period effects are really commonly mistaken for one another. It's a very common thing to do for people to kind of misunderstand what the source of variation is here, because conceptually, it's really hard to separate these sort of time and age bound sources of variance. And so this is an example. I just took a screenshot off of a tweet I saw once that I thought kind of perfectly embodied this conflation of cohort and period effects with one another. And this says, in 1978, 72% of American teens, a little bit of a typo here, has a summer job. The Bureau of Labor Statistics says it's fallen to 42% today. Job availability and summer school are some reasons why. So the explanation, job availability and summer school, are very clearly period effects, but the attribution here at the top, it says generational differences. All right, so it's really common to see people conflating the concepts of cohort and period effects with one another. It always leads to interesting conversations when it does. Some other kind of related methodological concerns. I discussed previously this idea of cross-temporal meta-analyses and some challenges associated with interpreting those. It's, just to be clear, not just that those methods conflate cohort and period effects, making it really difficult, if not impossible, to separate out the source of variance. It's that the effect itself can be very widely misrepresented by these types of models. And so this paper that I wrote with David Costanza and a couple of colleagues from 2020, we went through the literature and we reviewed and provided an empirical critique of all papers that had ever used, at least in the organizational sciences, this cross-temporal meta-analysis approach. And I mentioned that a few minutes ago. Just as a reminder, this is the type of approach to doing cross-temporal analysis where I would go into the literature and I would find, for example, studies that were done on narcissism among college students for, any number of periods of time. So I might find studies from the 70s and the 80s and the 90s and the early 2000s. But because they're all done among cohorts of college students, what I'm doing is I'm essentially holding age constant. And then if I look at the relationship between the time period in which the data were collected and the actual phenomenon of interest, which is to say in this case, narcissism, for example, I can see how levels of narcissism have changed over time. And so in this particular paper, we do a bit of statistical simulation using a Monte Carlo study framework. And we show that in many cases, the assumed cohort effect that is pulled out of cross-temporal meta-analyses is misestimated in the cross-temporal meta-analysis. And in some cases, it may be as much as 8.3 or 8.4 with some rounding times higher than it would be in the actual population. So just to be clear, it's not just that cross-temporal meta-analyses provide this sort of complex, confounded estimate. It's that the estimate itself is profoundly biased depending on the nature of what's being studied. And so I would very strongly urge you to not interpret the results of cross-temporal meta-analyses, because not only are they telling you kind of a complicated story, the story itself might be inaccurate. So again, yeah, because cross-temporal methods are based on these inferences, again, between different phenomena at different levels of analysis, as I discussed previously, when we discussed atomistic and ecological fallacies, because these correlations are based on correlations among group level phenomena, they again also present a very special case of that ecological relationship that I discussed, which is a relatively a bit obscure, but a long known statistical misspecification as well. And so what this brings us to in terms of these methodological concerns is that, taking a look at the whole literature here, nearly every study of generational differences in work outcomes has adopted either the cross-sectional or cross-temporal methodology. And so I have argued and would continue to argue that because all of the approaches that have been used to study generational differences, at least in the organizational sciences literature, so far have been based on these flawed methods, that it could be easily, I think, argued that there's never actually been an empirical study of generational differences in work outcomes. So the title of the talk is, where do we stand? Put differently, I think we can ask the question, what influence does the notion of generational differences actually have on the processes that we care about as organizational researchers and practitioners? And I would pose a larger question too. Obviously, the focus of the talk here is on work behaviors and processes, because that's the sandbox that I play in. But you can find the same issues present in any literature that tries to identify generational differences. That could be, broadly speaking, from, other fields of psychology through public health. There's even, research in, marketing and kind of other adjacent business related fields that try to do these things as well. So it's obviously not an easy question to answer. However, my take on all of this, based on the work that I've been doing for the past several years, is that there's not sufficient evidence available in the literature for generational differences to warrant all of the attention that they get in research and practice. And so this is a case where we kind of have to balance out, does the logic of this weigh more than the evidence? And in this case, I think the evidence is a bit light, whereas the logic that speaks against generational differences is of quite a bit more weight. And so, yeah, the general conclusion here is that I would suggest to you that generational differences are largely a management fad, at least in the literature that I work in. They're fashionable and they're novel, but they're really unsubstantiated ideas. And so the advice that I give to organizational scientists and practitioners and people who are generally thinking about the idea of generations and generational differences is that I would really strongly caution against applying generational differences as a broad label or sort of mechanism, I guess you could say, to explain shifts in processes in the workplace and beyond. In a best case scenario, this is just a misguided effort, right? You're putting attention towards something that doesn't really need a light shined on it, and you're putting resources towards managing generational differences that probably don't exist in the first place. In the worst case scenario, this can really breed what my colleagues and I have called generationalism. And we define generationalism in much the same way that we would define any other sort of ism, much the same way we would define ageism, for example, and that it's the belief that all members of a given generation possess characteristics or abilities or qualities in some respects that's specific to members of that generation. And this would be done in such a way to distinguish them as somehow inferior or superior to members of other generations. And so I think that the idea of generationalism and the fact that generations sort of exist as age-related structures is something that's really important to point out here. Here we can see, I took a screen, I like screenshots if you couldn't, I just collect these as I see them across different platforms that I have, but this is from LinkedIn. And you can see this is, you know, an advertisement for a company that's providing HR tips for attracting millennials, which is sort of a common, you know, application of the sort of thinking around generations. And so maybe that's benign on the surface, but you can see someone's response here that says, you know, just be okay with hiring people who will take your training and leave in a year for a competitor, which is like a very sort of generationalized take on this idea, based on this sort of misguided idea that millennials tend to be job hoppers and that they shift careers or they shift employers more frequently than members of other generations, which again, the evidence doesn't really speak to. I want to leave some time for questions. So just really quickly, you know, what do we do about this? Well, one of the things that I've done in my research too is to try to provide a sort of a lifespan informed solution perhaps to thinking about generations. And so, for example, you know, when we talk to organizational practitioners and they want to think in terms of generations, you know, we want to encourage them, instead of thinking about things in generationalized terms, we want to think about things in more of a lifelong, you know, career lifespan term. And so instead of thinking about generations, which are really exclusive and not inclusive, and they focus on groups and group differences, we tell people, no, think about this more across like a longer time span, you know, directly conceptualize and operationalize age as a continuous variable. Don't impose any sort of meaning on age. Don't try to construct or compare artificially construed age groups to one another. And so that's sort of one mode that we've used, trying to provide, especially like organizational leaders, with resources around how to you know, promote lifespan-based thinking that is a little bit more in tune to you know, the needs of an age-diverse workforce that doesn't require people to default back to thinking about generations. And so, you know, certainly recognizing age-related abilities, acknowledging the fact that people change over time, that we have, you know, developmental trajectories and personality and age-related differences and needs and motives and emotion regulation capacities and all the things that we know change as people get older. Understanding, you know, different life situations, and then, you know, thinking about, more broadly speaking, how we define and design work systems to optimally integrate all the dynamics that we see across the lifespan. So I'm not saying that this is necessarily the solution or necessarily that this idea of generations is going to go away. But we certainly probably no, we definitely need to spend a little bit more time thinking about what all of this means, and hopefully not default to these rather simplistic modes of understanding the complexities that are associated with getting older in context at work. I'll leave you with like my favorite XKCD cartoon that brings back something that I mentioned a few minutes ago, which is the conflation of cohort and age effects here. This is, millennials are killing the joint replacement industry, right? And so you can see baby boomers are far more likely to have knee and hip replacements than millennials. So they're clearly killing that industry, right? So, okay, that's what I've got.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, terrific. I think we have some questions.
Wonderful.
Natalie, do you just want people to come offline? Peter, do you want to ask your question to Dr. Rudolph?
Sure. So what kind of research methods do you recommend if, say, I wanted to tease apart age effects, period effects, cohort effects? Specifically, what kind of research methodologies would you recommend?
Yeah. And so there's a huge debate in this literature about how to do this. In fact, it's kind of been one of these longstanding concerns in research that has studied age in general. There are approaches that would allow you to study like successive cohorts of people. And so the sort of gold standard developmental design of a cohort sequential analysis would allow you to tease apart some of those effects, but doing a full-on cohort sequential design for most people is something that's just not feasible. There are attempts to use what's called that cross-classified hierarchical linear modeling, which allows you to fix different sort of then this is more of a statistical approach, but it allows you to, at some level, make assumptions about fixing sources of influence. So you, for example, could fix age effects in the model and then try to tease apart the different levels of period and cohort effects. But those still have a lot of problems with it. So I would say that this is like an open, long-standing debate in the sort of lifespan life course methodological literature without a simple answer. I don't think there's one solution, but the kind of most likely solution is a cohort sequential design, which is a challenge to pull off. And so everything else is just sort of trying to approximate the structure of that data statistically.
Great, thank you.
Cort, do you want to look in the chat? I don't know if I should have everybody come offline.
Sure.
The questions are pretty straightforward. Dr. Burge has one for you. Do you see it?
It says the number
Yeah.
of people quitting their job seems to be unique to the past year. Is this related or unique to any particular age group?
Yeah, I don't think we have a lot of data on that necessarily yet. I think that, you know, within all of this stuff, it's really complex. And again, this goes back to the thing about period effects that I was discussing before. It can be really complex to parse out these sources of variance. And so I don't think we have data that, you know, can say, oh, it's mostly young people who are quitting or mostly old people who are quitting. But we know that, for example, the pandemic accelerated retirements. But we also know that, like, when job markets become a little bit looser and people are, you know, finding opportunities, they're going to be more likely to quit. And so people who are younger might have a little bit more mobility to do that than people who are, for example, you know, middle-aged or older, who might be a little bit more tied because of family or something like that. And so I wouldn't say that there is evidence to suggest that there's an age gradedness to that quit pattern. My guess is if there was, it would be a really small effect. But we did see some dynamics in the retirement process that were perhaps accelerated by the pandemic. But a lot of that stuff is economic, you know, just broad macroeconomic stuff that then filters into job availability. Which would, you know, perhaps affect people of different ages differently, but I would say that's probably more of like a life stage argument than a generations argument. Well, I think you're muted, Nancy.
Nancy, you're muted.
Peter, is that a new question from you? Well, let me ask mine though first, Cort. Where the heck do these, who gets to decide when baby boomers were 1963 to 6, who gets to pick those dates? And on what rationale are they picked?
Yeah, well, there's a few different answers to that. I mean, there are these like kind of think tank organizations that every now and then bestow a label on a group. And so Pew Research does this a lot. So a lot of those come from Pew. There's a kind of a couple of books by researchers named Strauss and Howe who tried to, you know, figure out these labels, and they have kind of a complex sort of theoretical model that involves this concept of turnings, and they have these sort of epochal events that give rise to these things. Like, and just to be clear, like, I'm not saying that there wasn't a baby boom. Like, that's a very clear population phenomena, right? But the question is whether or not there's something that should demarcate members of that particular group from other people, and that's where the challenge is. So yeah, a lot of that comes from you know, marketing firms, research firms. It's an easy way to, you know, segment populations very quickly. That's where a lot of that comes from.
Right. I see Peter has another question about should we abandon generational categories, but are there any demonstrable generational differences in any arena? You know, not just working where you're saying doubtful, any arena.
Yeah. So I would say, well, to the first question, I mean, should we abandon generational categories? Like, I would say that they probably cause more harm than they clarify good, for whatever that's worth. I mean, you know, I try to avoid using that language in my own work as much as possible and just use like kind of general labels. I would say that, yeah, I mean, we kind of make a value judgment when we say that someone's a member of one generation versus another. And it can be used to categorize people in a very benign sense, but it can also be made, sort of a thinly veiled subtext for ageism. And so the answer to that question, I think, is probably different than what you're asking. I think, yes, we should stop using generational labels. We're starting to see court cases brought on the grounds of the Age Discrimination in Employment Act, where generational language has been used as sort of again, a subtext for ageism. And the interesting thing is, like, I showed you that slide with all those headlines that millennials are killing all this stuff, right? And if you believe Pew, who sets the cutoffs for these, the first millennials were born in 1980, which means that as of 2020, the first youngest millennials turned 40. And the Age Discrimination in Employment Act gives employment protections to people aged 40 and older. So technically, the people that are killing everything are considered to be older workers in the eyes of the law. And so the interesting thing about people making arguments about, millennials, and now it's whatever the next generation is or whatever, is that eventually, the luckiest among us get old, right? And so that time clock still moves, even if you're a member of one generation versus the other one. And so yeah, are there literatures in which we can find demonstrable generational differences? I mean, there are very interesting studies that have tried to, for example, look at how early childhood experiences shape later lifehood experiences. And so, like, I would point you towards, like, Glenn Elder's early work on, like, the children of the Depression. Those types of broad studies that follow large cohorts of people over long periods of time using cohort sequential studies. Berlin aging study, Seattle longitudinal study, those types of studies can parse out cohort effects. But any literature that's going to use the cross-sectional, cross-temporal, even longitudinal research designs can't truly parse out cohort effects. In fact, longitudinal designs just hold cohort constant. So there's even no variability associated with cohorts because you just follow the same people over time, right? And so though that's where I would look for that evidence, but we have to ask ourselves, what's the bigger, more theoretically relevant source of variance? Is it individual development, or is it the time and place in which you were born that gives rise to some sort of unique shared experience? And so yeah, like large scale events that affected especially specific segments of the population may give rise to something that looks like a cohort effect. But that's where I'd look for the answer.
Yeah, thank you. Any more questions in the chat? Please put it in. We have 1 minute more for this. Cort, why it seems to me that I've heard the word generational profiling, and it seems like we don't like profiling. Profiling is a bad thing. So how come this is so accepted? Because it does seem to be generational profiling. Why do we accept it and in fact seek training on it?
Yeah. I mean, I've made the argument in my work that it is just sort of this way that we kind of conveniently get around that difficult conversation about age, which is so interesting, right? Because everybody, lucky people experience this, right? Like, it's like very nearly universal human phenomenon. Ageism is not as socially sanctioned against as other isms, I would say. And so it provides a convenient way for us to discuss, if you just say, oh, the boomers who don't know anything, it's a little bit more convenient and maybe a little bit more socially acceptable than saying, my older colleagues don't really know how to do this technology. I don't know, I'm doing a bad job of explaining this, but I think you understand what I'm saying.
Yeah,
It's
yeah.
a little bit more sanctioned, and it's
a little more acceptable than having age categories or, age
Right.
or ageist kind of age profiling.
Exactly.
Yeah. Great. Any other questions? This has certainly been very informative. I really appreciate the work, and I didn't understand how much methodological consternation has to go on in trying to answer questions, and how little research there is really that is dealing with this, given how ubiquitous it is, as you said.
Yeah.
I wonder if the reason that we can't get ourselves to say, 60-year-olds don't know anything about this, is because we sound how crazy that is. Like we hear how crazy that is. not sound.
Mhm.
And I never thought about generational labels as coding for ageism. Like I never like the not allowed version
Yeah.
of ageism, and generational just sort of like grays it a little bit, makes it a little softer, and acts like, of course, you know, there are exceptions, but it just feels broader and more
Yeah.
distant. And so it becomes a way to overlook the obviously crazy way of lumping an entire, you know, years and years of birth ages of people together. But I never thought about it as like social coding before.
Mhm. Thanks, Jenna. Very insightful. It's a great way to end this fabulous presentation.